We'll begin right at 2 o'clock. Just wanted to do a quick sound check. Okay, we're going to get started here shortly. Just want to do a quick sound check before we get moving. Bear with us for just a moment while we make sure everything is functioning properly. Okay, we're going to get started here shortly. Just want to do a quick sound check before we get moving. Okay, it sounds like we're good. Welcome. Hello. Welcome to Introduction to Eating Disorders and Neurobiology. My name is Lori Johnson. I'm the Director of Education and Outreach and will be the moderator for today's webinar. The event today is brought to you by the Center for Balanced Living in Columbus, Ohio. And just to share a little bit of information with you about us, the center is located in Columbus, and we've had the privilege of helping clients and families for the past 17 years. We are a nonprofit organization, and actually we're the only freestanding nonprofit facility providing specialized eating disorder treatment, education, and research. Three important features of our treatment is the inclusion of neurobiology, family, and supports, and movement into the treatment process. And Dr. McCrae will be presenting an introduction to neurobiology of eating disorders today during this webinar. Much of the information is based on the work that our president and CEO, Dr. Laura Hill, has done with Dr. Walter Kay at the University of California in San Diego. And she's been developing cutting-edge treatment tools based on his brain imaging studies. And as you can see there on the screen, we have several levels of care here at the center, including outpatient, intensive outpatient, and partial hospitalization. We also recently opened an alcohol and other drug IOP, which enables us to treat substance use that co-occurs with the eating disorder. And a very unique program that we offer is our 5-day treatment for anorexia called NewFed TR. This intensive family treatment is receiving international recognition, and we're extremely optimistic about its effectiveness as preliminary data is showing positive outcomes. So if you know someone who needs treatment or support, our number is there on the screen. I invite you to call us 614-896-8222. One of our compassion experts will be happy to talk with you about which program might work best for your particular situation. Additionally, if you'd like more information, you're welcome to visit our website, www.thecenterforbalancedliving.org. And there's a lot of information today, and you may have some questions along the way. We'll reserve about 10 minutes at the end for our speaker to answer as many questions as possible. And I'll turn on the question and answer panel at that time. So if you have questions, just jot them down during the presentation, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time allotted. At this point, I want to introduce our featured speaker. Our guest today is Dr. Jason McCray. Jason is the Chief Clinical Officer here at the center. He's very interested in continuing to refine clinical applications of the neuroimaging research, and as you'll see in his presentation today, he fervently believes that sharing about the inner workings of the brain improves client and family experiences in treatment. Jason, welcome.
Thank you, Lori, for that very warm introduction. And I'd like to begin by thanking you for choosing to spend part of your National Eating Disorders Awareness Week with us, learning about some of the cool things that we do here at the Center for Balanced Living. So I want to begin with the Academy for Eating Disorders official position statement in 2009 that reiterated that, in fact, eating disorders are serious biologically based mental illnesses. The key points of the position statement include that anorexia and bulimia are highly hereditable as other serious mental illnesses, and that they are considered to be biologically based and that they're driven by brain mechanisms. The behaviors that make up eating disorders, so restricting of food, binge eating, and taking means to make up for that eating, whether that be self-induced vomiting or other purgatives, have been shown to alter brain structure, metabolism, and neurochemistry in ways that make it difficult for folks to stop those behaviors. Also, that eating disorders can be very debilitating. If you're watching this presentation, probably you're already aware of that. And the eating disorders are life-threatening, and that significant portions of folks with eating disorders die from them, more so than any other psychiatric illness. So one of the things that we believe here at the center is that teaching clients and their supports about the biology of eating disorders, what's going on in the brain, can improve the effectiveness of eating disorder treatment. And so by sharing with people what's going on in the brain, how that complicates treatment, and why that makes recovery more difficult, that can really help people to be more compassionate of their loved ones, and it can help clients to experience less frustration and hopelessness over the prospects of long-term change. One of the things that we do know is that with expert care, most folks with eating disorders can recover partially or even fully, provided that they're getting that excellent quality of care. So it encourages empathy rather than conflict with supports, and also directs client support and professional efforts in directions that are likely to be helpful. So there are certain things that might sound very good, but if you actually look at what's going on in the brain, aren't very likely to be helpful. So we'll talk about some of those over the course of the next 40 minutes or so. So I want to begin with, how do eating disorders happen? All right, so to begin with, there's not a shred of scientific evidence that family dynamics are a significant cause of eating disorders in most situations. There are, however, a great deal of indicators that family dynamics can be an essential part of recovery. And this is absolutely instrumental to our approach here at the center, that recruiting key supports, loved ones, spouses, parents, children, best friends, neighbors, clergy, whoever it is in the person's natural community that are their key supports, bringing them in to what is going on, what is needed to help someone get better, and to understand at least a little bit of what's going on in the brain that makes this so challenging is really important. In some ways, it's not crucial to understand how this happened. By going back and figuring out what led to this, it doesn't really change the steps forward, right? So if you have an eating disorder, food is medicine. Regulating metabolism with getting appropriate quantities of food at appropriate intervals throughout the day and not doing anything to make up for it is the first, second, and third line of medicine when it comes to eating disorders. So going back and figuring out what caused this, in some ways, is less important, but people really want to know. So I'm going to briefly review the state-of-the-art understanding of how this stuff happens. So stress diathesis. It's a common model in psychology, and we use it to describe lots of conditions. In its most basic form, diathesis is a combination of risk factors that make you vulnerable to something, and stress is an activating event that creates enough challenge for the person or the individual that that underlying vulnerability is set into motion. Most straightforward example would be PTSD. It might be the case that genetically, environmentally, and accidents of how my brain have evolved over the course of my lifespan, that I'm very predisposed to having a traumatic reaction. However, if I'm lucky enough not to have anything really bad happen, if I don't experience a trauma, then I still won't develop PTSD. And so this is a very simple way to look at stress diathesis. Even if I'm predisposed towards it, it takes something bad happening to activate it. So when we look at eating disorders, part of the diathesis is genetics. So anorexia and bulimia both appear to be very hereditable conditions. The hereditability coefficients range between 0.5 and 0.8, depending on whose data you're looking at. And that means that between 50 and 80% of the variability in who develops an eating disorder and who doesn't are relatable to genes. This is an enormous percentage. To contextualize this, the context for height, variability in hereditability estimates for height range between 0.6 and 0.8. So 60 to 80% of how tall you are is related to your genes. 50 to 80% of whether you get an eating disorder or not is related to your genes. These are roughly the same ballpark, and we're used to spending our time. You can look at people and say, oh, well, dad's tall and mom's tall. Obviously, the child's going to be tall. And so we're used to sizing people up in this very sorts of commonsensical way based off of hereditability estimates that are in the same range. And so eating disorders are highly hereditable. And if you're used to looking at people who are tall and they come from tall parents, or people are short and they come from short parents, eating disorders really run to that same degree that's very easy for us to understand. You can look at families and see how this stuff works. Eating disorders work the same way. Also for context, the most hereditable psychological trait is IQ. The point estimate for hereditability of IQ is 0.85. So when we talk about eating disorders, these are amongst the most hereditable psychological features that, that we've ever studied. There are some key alterations that have been identified. One of those is insufficient dopamine activity in the nucleus accumbens and the ventral striatum. We believe that those are activated by getting malnourished. I'll talk a lot more about that in the next few minutes. Also, we know that estradiol activity in adolescent girls appears to epigenetically be related to activating risk factors for anorexia, meaning that when there's that surge of estradiol just prior to puberty, that's one of the things that turns on some of the genetic risk factors and makes them become active. We see that in small children, the gender balance between girls and boys is a lot closer than it is from adolescence forwards. And that's due predominantly to estradiol. This is research that's been done by Kelly Klump at Michigan State. It's really been extraordinary research. So this genetic diathesis carries important implications for how we help folks with eating disorders. It helps by externalizing the illness and reducing blame. So this isn't something that your loved one is doing to you. This isn't something that your client is doing to their family. This is simply something that their genetic risk makes them vulnerable to. It also helps to understand why change is so hard. It can help reduce blame within the family system, which is really helpful in that it recruits those key supports as being back on the how do we get this better train as opposed to the how could you do this to us train. And there's a really fascinating international effort underway right now, a genomic-wide association test that's really helping to identify what are the candidate genes that might be related to this eating disorder risk so that we can better understand them. Realistically, we're looking at being 5, maybe as much as 10 years out from having good answers to those questions, but really, really smart people are asking them. All right, so diathesis is more than just your genes. It is also in part your lived life experience. And so there are tremendous bodies of work that you could fall all over yourself and never give enough credit to. Michael Levine and Linda Smolak, Sarah Mernon, and a bunch of others who've really spent a lot of time and effort identifying the toxic cultural factors that increase the risk of developing the eating disorder. Among these are exposure to high fashion images and the thin model ideal, internalization of that thin ideal as being something that does apply to you and that you are held to account for, that you're measured against. A variety of societal pressures on women and men to look certain ways, many others. Also, experiencing a traumatic life event is a risk factor. No one really understands how or why this works exactly, but we do know that in the general population, about 20% of women will experience a trauma at some point. Whereas for folks with anorexia, it's about 25%. For bulimia, it's about 33%. And for folks with binge eating disorder, it's roughly half. And so in some way, experiencing a traumatic life event is a risk factor for an eating disorder. And none of us really understand how exactly that works yet. There are certain competitive sports and performing arts, distance running, ballet, gymnastics, things like that, that due to a combination of high degrees of physical activity and or highly subjective aesthetic standards, that those also create risk factors, as do some medical conditions, such as a GI problem that may promote malabsorption can be a risk factor. So your risk factors combine, and I think about all of these things, your genes, how your brain has developed over the course of your lifespan, your lived experience, that all of those things sort of go into a vat and get stirred up to create your personal level of risk. So this is the world's largest vat of chicken noodle soup. It's an interesting picture to me. But I really think about all these risk factors as combining, and and then getting stirred up to create what your personal risk level is. And so if you have a very high risk level for an eating disorder, what happens is you start off with a very short fuse. And if you have a very low risk level for an eating disorder, then you start off with a very long fuse. One of the things that we know from the Minnesota starvation study is that when you get significantly malnourished, that fuse starts to burn. And when the burn is used up, when the fuse is burned up, what I conceptualize this as is when the fuse is burned up, that's the point at which the brain really starts to adapt and to express itself in different ways, to process things in different ways. And from that point on, the eating disorder takes on a life of its own. I'm going to talk a lot about what some of those things are over the course of the next 40 minutes or so. All right, so we all start off with different fuses. Some people start off with a short fuse. Some people get a longer one. Folks with a very low risk factor might start off with a very long fuse. And that fuse, of course, can get burned up no matter what the length is. So the stress diathesis, how this fits, is that vat of stew is your diathesis. That's your combined set of risk factors that determine how likely you are to be vulnerable to an eating disorder. And getting malnourished, usually through dieting, but it could be any one of a number of other things, putting out significantly more energy than you're taking in to a degree that is more than your body can handle. That's what causes that diathesis to get activated. That's the stress. So there are fantastic lines of neurobiological research by Walter Kay, Guido Frank, Joanna Steinglass, Tim Walsh. New brain that happened once the fuse is burned up. So the Minnesota starvation study. In the fall of 1944, a study was done at the University of Minnesota using conscientious objectors from World War II. They were trying to understand when someone is significantly malnourished, how can you safely refeed someone, and what is it that's going on with their metabolism during that time? Because when the Allies were liberating the concentration camps, they came across incredibly emaciated survivors of the camps. The soldiers would reach into their backpacks and hand over their MREs, their rations, which were the most nutrient-dense food that people were capable of creating at the time. And so, of course, the incredibly emaciated prisoners gobbled this stuff up, right? They were starving. And much to everyone's shock and horror, a goodly percentage of them went into toxic shock and died because their bodies couldn't process the nutrition. At the time, medical science didn't have any explanation as to what the heck was going on, hence the Ansel Keys study to try and understand this. So what happened was they took 36 men who were extensively screened for psychological and physical health problems. Then they were put on a 12-week induction period where they ate 3,200 calories per day, and they targeted getting all the guys to a BMI of approximately 22.0. And they did that give or take a point. And then for 24 weeks, so approximately 6 months, they were on what was called the semi-starvation phase, where they ate 1,800 calories per day. Does that sound like starvation to you guys? It's a number not terribly different from what a lot of diets are advocating. So they were on 1,800 calories per day, and they walked about 3 miles a day on top of their university activities. So they were all students at the university during this study. So 6 months, eating 1,800 calories per day and walking about 3 miles a day. All of their weights dropped to between about 90 and 100 pounds. And their BMI was in the lower teens for all of these guys at the end of the 6-month semi-starvation phase. Then for 12 weeks, they tried out different combinations of macronutrients and different kinds of food to try and understand when somebody's at that very suppressed weight, what is a safe way to refeed them and what is it that's going on metabolically that makes that difficult or dangerous. Then there were an additional 8 weeks of uncontrolled refeeding, which was essentially, please, for the love of God, eat and get some weight back on. So here are some pictures of what the guys looked like during the study. In the upper left, you have an example of what they looked like at the beginning of the study. This is Sam Legg. And then just below that is a picture of Sam at the end of the 6-month semi-starvation phase period. And so these are guys who went from a very healthy, virile physical standing to being incredibly emaciated. And off to the right are 3 other participants of the study, really sort of detailing that these folks were quite underweight at the end of that 6-month period of 1,800 calories a day and 3 miles a day. So what did we learn? We learned a lot of things. We're trying to understand how do you safely refeed people. What we ended up understanding was a whole bunch of other stuff. This work is 2 volumes. It almost looks like an encyclopedia. It's so big. It's about 1,400 pages. For our purposes, the most important finding is that 36 out of 36 men developed all these associated psychological features of anorexia nervosa. Now, if we look at demographic information, men are at roughly 10% the risk of anorexia that women are. And so epidemiologically speaking, about 1 in 500 men should have expressed this set of responses to getting malnourished. And 36 out of 36 men who were extensively pre-screened developed all of these psychological features. So in a very important way, in a fundamental way, one of the things that the Ansel Keys study taught us is that many of the key features that we think of as anorexia nervosa are in fact the effects of starvation, not the cause of starvation. Now, when this study was done, we didn't really have a category for anorexia yet. So it took decades before the significance of these findings was recognized so far as the eating disorder world. However, we do look back at this study as sort of being now we understand what happens. It's the starvation that activates the psychological features, not the other way around. So getting malnourished gives you the features of anorexia. It's not the features of anorexia that make you starved. All right, so when you get too malnourished for your own physiology, your fuse burns up. And what happens when fuses burn up? You get explosions. Or in this case, what you get is you get a brain adaptation to this prolonged state of being malnourished to a degree that's greater than your body can take. So it's impossible to overemphasize. People who develop eating disorders, by and large, are those who began with an increased risk or susceptibility. Their diathesis made them vulnerable to developing an eating disorder. So using that fuse metaphor, they started off with a shorter fuse than most folks get. So once she or he has exceeded their body's limits for how malnourished it can be, for how long it can be malnourished, the brain triggers a whole series of adaptations. And those things, in many ways, are what give the eating disorder life. They're things that perpetuate symptoms in ways that we'll talk about shortly. Now, here's one of the problems. You never really know where that limit is. You never really know how long your fuse is until you've exceeded it. And so oftentimes, the person who started off at higher risk of an eating disorder wasn't doing anything overly extreme to exceed their body's limits. It may have been a very typical diet, the same diet that the three best friends were going on to look good in their prom dress. Or it could have been not making any particular changes to their eating habits, but increasing how much exercise they were doing, maybe because a sport came in season, or maybe they just decided they liked running. For folks who start off at very high risk and very high vulnerability, a very short fuse, getting a bad GI bug could do it. It could be anything that causes you to get malnourished, even for a relatively short period of time, if you're somebody who started at high risk. All right, so a very abrupt change. We're going to talk a little bit about digestion, energy, and neurotransmitters. So when we eat, your body needs to prioritize how does it make use of the energy that you've eaten, the food that you've eaten. And so your body wants to run on glucose. So your body is always going to metabolize carbohydrates first, which get turned into glucose, the body's preferred energy source. While that's happening, proteins are breaking down, and you can think about them as being interlocking fibers that are sort of slowly getting pulled apart. And that process releases some long neutral amino acids. One of those is tryptophan. Probably tryptophan rings a bell because folks talk about it around Thanksgiving time, because that's what's in the turkey that makes you so tired. Totally an urban legend. Turkey actually has no more tryptophan than any other source of meat. It's the enormous meal that makes you tired. Anyways, so the food that we eat, it's composed of different macronutrients. So you get carbohydrates, you get proteins, and you get dietary fats. And these ingredients, the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fats that we eat, those become the basis for creating all of our neurotransmitters, all of our hormones, and everything in our body, frankly. So when we eat, proteins break down in the stomach, and you get some long neutral amino acids. One of those is tryptophan. Your body's going to metabolize tryptophan into a substance called 5-H1AA. It's 5-hydroxy-1 amino acid. When that crosses the blood-brain barrier, which is sort of a squishy, spongy filter layer around your brain that's meant to keep toxins out, the 5-hydroxy-1 amino acid gets converted into serotonin, and serotonin levels in your brain rise. So we eat, and your body metabolizes protein into serotonin. Interesting stuff. Kind of wondering why we're talking about this, though, right? Here's why. I'm going to explain to you how restricting food intake works for folks who have anorexia. So for reasons that we don't really understand yet, there's an orbitoprefrontal cortex dysfunction. That's one of the early things that happens when you develop an eating disorder. And so part of the illness is that your orbitoprefrontal cortex begins responding inconsistently to dopamine and serotonin signals that are usually partially what mediate hunger and satiety. So you've got ghrelin and leptin on the hormonal level, and on the neurotransmitter level, you've got dopamine and serotonin, which play important roles in helping to guide food. So the role of serotonin at the OPFC is that it drives this sort of calm, planful, reasonable engagement. Do I need to eat? Nah, I had lunch a couple of hours ago. I'm going to have a snack in about an hour. When I see that brownie that looks good, I may well decide to eat it, but there's no particular urge or need or drive that I need to. It's a calm and planful decision, generally speaking. Dopamine, on the other hand, that drives seeking behavior, and it's what gives us pleasure. And so when you're hungry, there's a vagal nerve signal that comes up from your intestines saying, I need food to be breaking down. And so the orbital prefrontal cortex becomes sensitive to dopamine, and when you eat, it gives you pleasure, it makes you feel like eating. This is very good. It makes you more likely to stay alive, less likely to starve, and more likely to pass on your genes. Then once that physical signal for hunger disappears, serotonin becomes the dominant force at the OPFC, and it kind of keeps you in that reasonable, planful, logical state of mind with regard to food in between meals. This is if you do not have an eating disorder. So once anorexia sets in, once your brain has started to respond to being too malnourished for your biology, one of the things that happens is that stops switching to this sort of dopamine sensitivity. The dopamine sensitivity becomes much less. And so what happens is not only do you not get reward from dopamine when you do eat, when you're hungry, but it stays acutely locked into serotonin. And if we go back to our last slide, we see that when you eat, your body turns proteins into serotonin, right? So serotonin in very high levels at some brain sites result in high anxiety. Wouldn't you know it, the orbital prefrontal cortex is one of those places where if there's too much serotonin, we are crawling out of our skin with anxiety. Now, if you don't have an eating disorder, you're cool now because you're hungry and you're eating and your brain's paying attention to dopamine and you're feeling this profound sense of reward. I was so hungry and I ate and that feels great. But if you have anorexia, it's paying attention to serotonin when you eat. And when you eat, your body starts breaking down those proteins into serotonin and you become acutely anxious. And you're really, really locked into that experience of your elevating level of anxiety. So literally, the body metabolizing protein results in anxiety if you have an eating disorder. Not due to thoughts. So this isn't, I'm afraid I'll gain weight, or I'm afraid it's going to go straight to my thighs, although those thoughts may be there. Literally on a biological level, neurochemistry, your body metabolizing proteins creates anxiety if you have anorexia nervosa. So by avoiding food and proteins, it results in calm. And so when I eat, I feel anxious. If I don't eat, I feel less anxious. So anxiety goes to avoidance, right? It's one of the most well-replicated findings in all of psychology. And so if you're afraid of heights, what do? You freak out a little bit when you see this picture and you avoid heights. You don't go to heights, right? Like you structure your life around never having to be in situations like the one depicted in this picture. And if for some reason or another, clowns mess with you, then probably you avoid clowns. So Pennywise here is not your friend. You're going to go out of your way to not have to be around him. And if for whatever reason creepy crawlies and spiders freak you out, probably you're going to structure your life around not being around spiders. So when something creates anxiety for you, we avoid it. So if you have anorexia, and every time you eat, your body doing its thing and metabolizing food results in you feeling anxious, is it really all that shocking that we begin to avoid eating? If you didn't like spiders, you'd sure avoid that. If every time you eat this, you crawl out of your skin with anxiety, it is in fact a pretty natural response to begin avoiding that. And that's how restricting food intake works when you have anorexia. Eating makes you anxious, and not eating keeps you calm. And there's a very well understood at this point neurobiological reason that drives that. And that's that orbital prefrontal cortex dysfunction when you develop anorexia nervosa. So purging, self-induced vomiting. Most folks, if you ask them, will say that vomiting, whether it's self-induced or not, is one of the most aversive experiences that we have. On average, Americans vomit about 4.7 times per year, and most people rate that as being one of the least pleasant things they do in the course of a year. How on earth is it that folks get into this cycle where they repeatedly make themselves sick on purpose? Here's how. Vomiting, no matter the cause, whether it's a GI bug or whether it's self-induced following a binge, sheds a lot of fluid, and with those fluids, you shed electrolytes, particularly sodium and potassium are the things that we're concerned about here. Now, that's dangerous. So if you get dehydrated, well, that may not sound so bad, but if you get dehydrated, your electrolytes can get off. And if you don't have the proper levels of sodium and potassium, it interrupts the electrical activity around your heart. And if the levels get depressed enough, then literally there's not enough of a charge differential to support the electrical impulses that make your heart beat. And so if your electrolytes get off too far, if your sodium and potassium get off too far, then literally your heart stops beating because there's not enough electrical discharge to make it beat. So your brain's super smart, right? It wants to keep you alive. It wants to make sure that this thing does not happen. So whenever you vomit, no matter the reason, your brain says, I know what to do with this. I'm going to release this thing called vasopressin. Vasopressin is kind of this weird, it's kind of a hormone, it's kind of a neurotransmitter, it acts in different ways at different brain sites. But vasopressin is this magical substance that your brain releases whenever you vomit, and it's a very, very powerful antidiuretic. So whenever you throw up, your brain says, we could die if we get dehydrated. Let's not let that happen. And so it releases this vasopressin, and it signals your body to hold on to a whole bunch of fluid. Now, if you've got bulimia, and you just binge ate, and you make yourself sick, that's to try and undo that food that you just ate. It's totally an ineffective strategy. A talk for another day. We know scientifically that doesn't work very well. But so you've just made yourself sick. Now your brain says, whoa, hey, I need to hold on to all this fluid. So you're going to get bloated. Your body's going to hold on to a bunch of water. And while you're stuck in your eating disorder mind, that water retention, that bloat is going to feel like, holy cow, am I getting fat? I need to not eat all day. So I'll go all day the next day and eat as little as I possibly can. And what is the most reliable trigger for binge eating? It's going too long without eating. So all day I didn't eat because I overate last night. So when I do eat at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, shockingly, I binge eat. And then I feel like I need to vomit again to make up for that, which again, does not work. Scientifically, this is not a sound strategy. Then what happens? I retain more water and I get more bloated. It's this really horrible cycle that gets out of control in a hurry. All right, but so how does this happen, right? Because vomiting is supposed to be this really aversive thing that we don't like. Well, in addition to vasopressin telling your body to hold on to as much water as possible so you don't die, it also hits your opiate receptors. And so vasopressin acts on opiate receptors, and it sort of creates this pain relief. It releases the sense of, I am incredibly anxious. Oh my gosh, I'm going to gain 13 pounds from what I just did. And then I make myself sick, and there's this profound, And you can think about this in your own life. If you've had a bad stomach bug, and you've been very sick to your stomach, and then you finally do get sick and you throw up, one of the things we usually tell ourselves is, wow, my stomach felt so bad, and now that I've been sick, it feels better. That's not that your stomach is now empty and you feel better. It's that when you threw up, your brain released some vasopressin, and it gave you that profound sense of relief and, when it hit your opiate receptors. And so usually folks don't start self-inducing vomiting to regulate their mood, but one of the things they figure out after a whole bunch of cycles of I overate, I'm distressed, let me throw up, that makes it feel better, is that if you throw up when you didn't just overeat, that still makes you feel better. And so that vasopressin activity on your opiate receptors, it's very grossly speaking now, we're not talking about like, heroin or oxycodone levels of opiate activity. We're talking like, I don't know, maybe Tylenol 3 levels of activity. But the end result, just like you see with cutting, just like you see with other maladaptive methods of mood regulation, you go from a very high distress state to, and depending on the person, you're going to get somewhere between 5 and maybe 30 minutes of really significant relief from that emotional distress. And so one of the things we know is if you feel bad and you do something and that makes that thing go away, we're likely to do that again when we feel bad. And so purging works by releasing that vasopressin, which acts on your opiate receptors, which reduces distress. This is really important to know. So binge eating, we have much less research on how binge eating works than we do on the other symptoms of eating disorders. Editorially, I think that this is in part because a lot of the research dollars that could be going to help understand binge eating are going to obesity research for a variety of policy reasons. So suffice it to say that we have less detail about how binge eating works than we do the other symptoms of eating disorders. However, what we do see is that initially when someone is binge eating, there's this very strong insula response. So the insula are responsible for interoceptive awareness and sort of locking into those sensations that are coming up to the brain from your body about what's going on. And so there's this really powerful taste sensation in the insula, and that's paired with a very strong sense of reward in the nucleus accumbens. So there's a lot of dopamine activity. So it tastes really good, and my brain's making me feel really good about how well that tastes, or how good that tastes. And so there's this incredibly powerful initial sense of reward, And then after the first few bites, it just goes flatline. So it was really, really amazing. And then it disappears. So just like Charlie Brown running up to kick his football there, and Lucy snatches it away at the last moment, you get this incredible, wow, these donuts are the greatest thing ever. And oh, hey, what happened? Like, this isn't so good anymore. And for reasons that we don't really understand yet, the brain creates this strong impulse to accelerate consumption. If I have more and if I have it more quickly, then maybe it will feel that good again. And it just doesn't. And so, again, for reasons that aren't entirely well understood at this point, the mechanisms that might ordinarily inhibit these urges and slow down consumption, they're not performing their functions adequately. And so consumption accelerates and it becomes, let me eat more, let me eat it faster. And that usually that will proceed until the point that there's physical pain from the stretching and the lining of the stomach. And that's finally the signal that's able to burst through and say, hey, we need to stop now. And so there's this really powerful initial reward followed by a flat line, and then the brain accelerates saying, let me eat more and let me eat faster. And there's that where that loss of control comes in. All right, so here's a nifty MRI of a human being looking in profile. And we're highlighting some of the significant brain sites that are involved in eating disorders based off of our current understanding of symptoms. And so, kind of going down the chain in the order that we'll talk about them, there's the insula. Again, that's responsible for awareness of what's going on in the body and interoceptive awareness. There's the amygdala, which is incredibly important as sort of a danger recognizer and an alert center of the brain. The nucleus accumbens is involved in pleasure and reward. The orbital prefrontal cortex is going to be involved in sort of mediating, is this an approach or avoid? Is this a stop or a go? The caudette's going to perform some sort of an evaluation on that of it's good or it's bad. The anterior cingulate cortex is going to be executive decision-making. What should I do with all this information I have so far? The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is about anticipating the future and what's going to happen next. The parietal lobe is involved in sort of integration of sensory information from various parts of the body and putting this together into a experience. And the occipital lobe is involved in visual information. So what we see in folks who have anorexia, you eat something and then a signal comes up your brainstem and it goes through the thalamus and it's processed in your insula. And you get this taste like cardboard. There's really no taste that's associated with this thing that I'm eating because we know that insular activity is very underwhelming in folks who have anorexia. The amygdala kind of freaks out, right? Because you eat something that's supposed to taste like something, and if I'm eating something and it doesn't taste like anything, maybe something's wrong. So the amygdala is kind of like, I'm not so sure about this. Consequently, the nucleus accumbens, which could give you pleasure, instead it's like, yuck, you know what, this is no good. No pleasure here. Next up, you kind of get this, you know what, I'm not so sure about this. Maybe I ought not approach this from the orbital prefrontal cortex. The caudette is going to evaluate it's good or it's bad. This is bad, right? Because it doesn't taste like anything. That's not jiving. I'm getting no pleasure from this. I have this sense of uncertainty, and you know what, when in doubt, let's not proceed. And so the anterior cingulate cortex says, do not eat this thing. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is all uncertain, right? It's like, I thought I was hungry. I'm eating. Something's wrong. This isn't good. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And so there's this very, anticipatory, something's wrong. I don't know what's going on. At some point you start to get this building anxiety from that serotonin cycle that we talked about earlier. And so there's this uncertainty and fear evaluating, I'm not sure what's going on here. So the parietal lobe it's sort of integrating what's going on in body senses, proprioception and body image is like, my goodness, like I'm eating this thing and it's not right. I look huge. I feel huge. Then you take your second bite and the whole thing starts all over and it tastes like cardboard. I'm afraid, yuck, I don't know about this. It's bad. Don't eat it. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? I look huge. Oh my goodness, I'm going to be really brave. I'm going to take a third bite. And so you can see if this is what's going on in your brain when you're eating, which it is for folks with anorexia, eating is not a pleasurable experience. So binge eating, what we get is the sensory impulse comes up the brainstem, passes through the thalamus, it goes to the insula. Wow, this is great. So I ate something and it tastes good. The amygdala doesn't really have anything to say about that, but the nucleus accumbens is, this is great and I need more. Next up, we've got the orbital prefrontal cortex, approach avoid. So red light, green light. I need more and I need it now. Like this isn't just a green light, it's a flashing green light with neon banners around it. Got to do this stuff. The caudette, this is great, and like let's try adding chocolate. And so the anterior cingulate cortex says, yep, let's eat it. And then the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, again, anticipating the futures, I need more, I need it now, hurry this darn thing up. And after a couple of bites, you get, oh, well, where's the taste? There's nothing. And so you don't get that, it's great. You just get the, it's not enough. Then you get, I need more and I need it now. And really what happened, like this tastes so good, it's gone. Well, I better eat it. I better eat more now. And then this whole cycle kind of accelerates and it runs out of control. And that's where you get the loss of control eating. So here's kind of a brief review of some of that stuff. If you're watching the video, feel free to pause here and revisit it as you like. It's kind of summarizing the information that we just went through more experientially. All right, so another thing that we see that's neurobiologically based in many clients with eating disorders is the sense of it being very difficult to make and to trust decisions. And so making and trusting decisions is very commonly a problem in folks who have all manner of eating disorders. And one of the reasons for that is the role of dopamine in decision making. And so there's a spot in the anterior insula that when you try on something, if you're stepping into something you're not quite sure and there's this sort of subjective evaluation, what you see is there's this kind of confirmatory bump of just a little bit of dopamine. So if I get up in the morning and I try on an outfit, and this thing, maybe not today, so I try on another outfit and then that one feels okay. You can watch in an fMRI, there's this little confirmatory bump of, ooh, okay, that's okay. And it helps us to feel good about the decision. And it's sort of very reassuring. So its absence can be quite distressing. And one of the things that we see on a trait basis is folks, particularly with anorexia, but some folks with bulimia, have very high levels of harm avoidance. And so if when I'm responding to something that's open-ended, that anterior insula dopamine bump sort of helps me to feel reassured about something, and that's not happening, that's distressing, and that can feel a little bit like harm. And so this whole like responding to an open-ended question thing starts to feel unsafe. So one of the things that we see in treatment is that when folks are feeling overwhelmed or when folks are highly symptomatic with their eating disorder, offering closed-ended multiple choice questions instead of open-ended questions can sometimes be more effective, and it can help people to get unstuck when there's kind of this logjam thing going on. So ideally, offering somebody 3 options that we know from past experience are likely to be acceptable to them. Wait a minute. Did you just say? I did, in fact, yes. So when anxiety and distress are high, responding to open-ended questions can be very difficult for folks with eating disorders. So the very highly active prefrontal areas facilitate it being much easier for them psychologically to evaluate closed-ended multiple choices. What would I rather do this evening? I can go to a movie, I can take a walk with the dog, or I can do a puzzle with my kid. Being able to pick between the 3 of those, even if I don't love any of those options, psychologically is fairly comfortable. Because the prefrontal areas that do that sort of pro-con analysis work great in folks with eating disorders. And there are other sites that are kind of involved in sifting through the many options that don't work so well. And so if I ask you, what would you like to do this evening? Maybe I have those 3 options, or maybe there's this open-ended response. Well, what might I do tonight? I might hop a rocket ship to the moon. Probably I'm not going to, and so I'm not going to consider that one with the same level of detail and the same level of deliberation that I could do the puzzle with my kid, I could walk the dog, or I could go to the movie. And so one of the things that experientially folks with eating disorders talk about is when they're highly distressed, they might approach answering that open-ended question where every possibility, hopping a rocket ship to the moon tonight, gets the same level of detailed analysis that which movie would I like to see might get. And so obviously that's overwhelming. And so when folks are stuck, when you ask them a question, they get that, I'm not sure kind of response, then shifting gears and offering a closed-ended multiple choice set of options instead of the open-ended question can be much more effective. Now, this involves being much more directive than we are taught to be when we're in therapy school. I don't know about your training, but mine was based off of ask as many open-ended questions as possible. You're going to get more information and you'll get things that'll surprise you. So this recommendation runs directly counter to the training that most of us received in school. And it's a really important tool to have in your tool belt if you're doing a lot of work with folks with eating disorders. When they get stuck, shift gears from the open-ended question, ask multiple choice questions, and it's perfectly okay to give them is it this, or would you like something else? So moving towards the end of our time here, I want to reiterate, really part of the reason why understanding this neurobiology is so important is that eating disorders are deadly. So about 4% of people who have anorexia are going to die from it in medical complications. About 4% of people with bulimia are going to die from it in the medical complications. About 5% of people with binge eating disorder are going to die from it or related conditions. If you don't get treatment, about 20% of people die. And in a statistic that's particularly jaw-dropping to me, a study by Scott Crow found that carrying an anorexia diagnosis for 10 years or longer increases your risk of dying by suicide by a factor of 58.1 times. These things kill people. It's not just the soundbite that anorexia has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric condition. This really is something that is a health crisis for people who are experiencing it. It's something that the entire family and support system around the client really needs to rally together and to treat it like the health crisis that it is, because this is something that it kills people. Any of these conditions mixed with substance abuse makes it dramatically more dangerous. So if you want to learn more about any of the things that I've talked about today, just want to throw in a couple of plugs here. The center runs a 5-day treatment program based off of precisely this kind of research that Lori talked about at the beginning. It's our 5-day treatment program called NewFed-TR. I've got the website for that particular program here on the slide. If you want more information, you can call our main number, which is 614-896-8222, and ask about the 5-day program or NewFed-TR for more information. Also in the coming year, we're looking at exploring offering on-site and potentially out in the community trainings based off of this treatment model. Combined with that, there's a therapist manual describing in detail the program based off of all of this kind of research and how you can conduct precisely this kind of a treatment in an hour-by-hour, minute-by-minute, activity-by-activity sort of 40-hour treatment protocol that's going to be published as an e-text this fall. So please check our website for updates on release dates and to find out more information about this. References, because we always like to know how we know what we know. And now I'll turn it back over to Lori.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead now and turn on the question and answer panel. Okay, it is now on. So if you do have questions for Jason, go ahead and submit those now, and he'll answer as many as he possibly can. While you're typing those in, he mentioned the 5-day program. I will also mention our conference on April 21st. That is also about that 5-day program and kind of a behind-the-scenes look at what goes on during that program. So I would encourage you to take a peek at our website and look at the details about that conference. We'd love to have as many of you as possible attend that as well. So just waiting for some questions to pop in there.
So there's a question that's, I don't understand the link in the brain pictures for anorexia. I'm afraid I look huge. So kind of what's happening here is that when somebody with anorexia begins to eat, the chain is going to begin with the insula or under firing in response to taste. And so very literally, the brain is not getting much of a picture or much stimulation from the body about, like, I'm eating something and this tastes like broccoli, or it tastes like cardboard, or it tastes like anything. And so in response to that sort of lack of sensation while you're eating, which isn't really what the brain's set up to handle, the amygdala kind of freaks out a little bit and says, you know what, this might potentially be dangerous. And the amygdala's job is to help keep you alive and to avoid danger. And so it kind of sends this, I'm not so sure about things picture. And so in response to that, what you get is a whole series of things that go wrong, from not getting any pleasure related to the food, to that driving further uncertainty. And as anxiety starts to rise, one of the things that we see is that there are sites in the parietal lobe that appear to be related to body image that become very, very active as the distress increases. And so when we talk with clients about, here's what's happening in your brain sites, and here are things that you might be experiencing, tell us if this fits for you or not. And we ask clients to describe what is going on in their head as they eat. What we've heard from numerous clients with anorexia is that as that distress mounts, there's this increasing sense of, I feel very, very large. I feel like I look huge. And as distress mounts, the body image distress becomes greater as well. I hope that helps with that question. I've got another question about how can you successfully do treatment with only a 5-day treatment? That is a fantastic question and one that we get quite a lot. So really what this program is meant for is predominantly folks who are coming to us that have had prior treatments before. Oftentimes they've had many level of care treatments before. So they've been to various IOPs or various partial hospitalization programs, sometimes various residential programs. And what we do is we bring the client in, and they have to come with at least one support person, but the more the merrier. And so we'll have the client and their spouse and their parents and their best friend all in the room for 45 hours of treatment across 5 days. And so we're essentially doing a whole year's worth of family therapy in a week. And what we do is we provide an awful lot of this sort of brain-based information with very experiential activities to make it more accessible and that really allow people to have clear take-home messages of this is how it applies to me and this is how it applies to my loved one. As a part of this treatment program, what we do is we really go through all the various eating disorder and other self-destructive behavior that clients have, and we work out in a very collaborative way with the client and with the supports. Here are the sorts of things that, because of where you're at neurobiologically, are likely to be working well, and the things that are more likely to be challenging. And so actively engaging the client and their supports, we develop an incredibly detailed behavioral agreement for, okay, so you need to follow your meal plan if you're going to get better. What are the barriers to following your meal plan? Okay, well, I don't want to do it, and I might hide food, and it's really hard to make sure that I have lunch every day. And so we go through line by line, and okay, so you don't want to do it. So if you're going to commit to, I'm going to make this effort to follow a meal plan, if you get off track, where are you going to get off track? Okay, so what would be helpful in that point? All right, so sitting down with your meal, and if you're alone, taking a picture of that and texting it to your mom at home. And then 20 minutes later, or 30 minutes later, or 45 minutes later, when you finish eating it, taking a picture of the empty plate to mom really helps you to feel more accountable and feel more motivated to do that. All right, so which meals are the most problematic? Mom, can you be available to receive these messages at these times? Can you call and check in if an hour after the first picture you don't hear from them? And we really develop these very, very granular level behavioral agreements that are based off of all the eating disorder symptoms and what the client can do for themselves, what they need from their support people to be able to do, what they need from their treatment team to be able to be successful, and in an incredibly detailed sort of way, taking into account all these behaviors, all the traits that they've endorsed are true for them, and all of the knowledge that we have about what's going on neurobiologically to create a treatment plan that's going to be more detailed and I think better informed than things that they've had before. Then when they leave us after the 5 days, they're going to return to their home treatment team, who will have been very, very close contact with throughout the week, who's going to get a copy of the behavioral agreement and talk that through with our treatment team to make sure that all of the various wrinkles of what have been worked out are understood by the home treatment team. We've even had cases where the home treatment team comes and attends a day or two of the treatment with us, or that they call in on a conference call during the daily case management sessions. And so that really we're creating this comprehensive wraparound behavioral agreement that goes with this very different kind of education about what's going on and why this is so difficult. And that's all wrapped within this plan of this agreement of here's how we move forward to make sure that the things that need to happen do happen, which frankly are going to be eating enough food spaced out throughout the day in a reasonable fashion and not doing anything to make up for it. All right, I've got another question of, has the incidence increased or is it just being better diagnosed? So it's tricky to know when you look at population-based data like this. I think that probably it's a little bit of both. And so if you look at research on over time, how thin ideal images in the media, that those things have probably increased, or not probably, those things have increased from the 70s to the 80s, the 80s to the 90s, and that they've continued to increase since then. We also see that objectifying sexualized images of men have also increased over those same sorts of time intervals. And so it's creating a lot more insecurity about how you look, which is leading more and more people to diet more and more often. And when we go back to the beginning of the talk, when I was talking about the stress diathesis model, really it's that getting malnourished that activates those epigenetic risk factors. And so if folks are dieting a little bit more people are going to sort of go a little bit too far or exceed the boundaries of what their body could happen. So more people's brains are going to respond to that malnourished state. And they're going to do so by getting that orbitoprefrontal cortex dysfunction and not signaling serotonin and dopamine properly. And it's going to set off this whole cascade. Let's see. I've got another question here that says, based off of what we know, in cases where somebody struggles with anorexia and it almost appears like it's in tandem with bulimia, what does this tell us about the body's response and how it survives? So there are a couple of pieces kind of embedded in this question. And one of them is this idea of diagnostic migration. And so some folks who have anorexia will eventually develop bulimia or possibly even binge eating disorder, and that people can kind of move back and forth between the various diagnoses. And that's complicated even further by the whole, like, there's this binge purge subtype of anorexia that some people have too. And so what I think is going to happen, everything that I've talked about on the slides, I can point to particular scientific studies for how we know the things that we know. What I'm about to say here is more in the realm of speculation. I think it's reasonably well-grounded speculation, but I want to be clear that it's speculation. I think that this kind of brain-based response to, if you get malnourished, the brain's going to adapt to that. Because if you're in a hunter-gatherer society and the herd has moved on and the crop has failed, you know that you're hungry, you're actively seeking out food. Being constantly aware on a brain-based level of, oh geez, you're starving, doesn't really improve your odds of survival. And so at some point, the brain has this mechanism of, yeah, I've got it, we need to find food. And so if you have to chase the herd or if you have to find new foraging grounds, that's a pretty helpful response that keeps you alive and makes you more likely to pass on your genes. In a modern society where we have supermarkets and we have restaurants and things like that, that very same response that's sort of, yeah, I've got it, you're hungry, we'll take care of it when we can, that becomes a very different proposition when food is readily available. And so I think that there probably is this kind of survival feel to how some of this happens. And so at some level, if food is readily available and the person is not making use of that, they're not eating, I speculate that some folks' brains are like, you know what, by golly, if there's food here, I'm not going to let you starve. And then that urge to binge eat and to have that loss of control eating takes over. And anecdotally, from all of my clinical experience, once somebody starts binge eating, their ability to restrict long periods of time with a high frequency really deteriorates at that point. And they begin to binge eat more, which brings on some more of the purgative behaviors generally. And really, those purgative behaviors are the ones that are the most acutely dangerous. We've got a question about the percentage of men and women with anorexia. The typically cited statistics are that about 90% of people with anorexia are women and 10% are men. If you look at, there are a number of academics that make good arguments that that's probably underreporting the actual percentage of men. And so there are people who would argue anywhere between 90-10, which is the typical statistic, up to maybe as high as 20% men, 80% women, but it's definitely more women than men. And again, from the work of Kelly Klump at Michigan State, we know that risk factors, genetic risk factors that are epigenetically activated by female puberty are one of the things that help to drive those sex differences. How common is, I've got a question, how common is sexual abuse in folks with eating disorders, and how can it affect it? It is very common. So again, about half of folks with binge eating disorder will have been significantly traumatized, about a third with bulimia, and about a quarter with anorexia. A large percentage of that in most studies is sexual trauma, although certainly not all of it. And so how exactly that interfaces with the eating disorder, we don't really know. We do know that objectively it's a risk factor that makes somebody more likely to develop an eating disorder. However, so far as I'm aware, nobody really understands the mechanism of that at this point. We do have a question that the sound might be dropping in and out, so if that's happening, I apologize. I've got a question, if we could make the food taste better to somebody with anorexia, would that help to interrupt the brain cycle? That is a fantastic question. I think it's something that a lot of people are interested in. And so if we could kind of get that insula site upregulated so that it was providing more stimulation, that is potentially something that could perhaps change things. There's some really smart people doing research along those lines at this point, but I don't think it's a question that we've answered yet. Also got a question specifically about the 5-day program. Do we offer some kind of support or follow-up after the 5-day program. So yeah, we work very closely to hand off with the home treatment team. So we have that kind of support. And on a monthly basis, we have call-in question and answer sessions that are sort of based off of helping people to perpetuate the meal plans and the nutritional strategies that we advocate for at the center. And so sometimes that's different from what somebody's home treatment team has used. So we have these sort of call-in sessions to provide general information about how to continue to comply with those meal plan recommendations, and to help both clients, supports, and home treatment teams to understand those, the nutritional side of the equation. We don't have a firm date yet, but the Center for Balanced Living does in fact have a smartphone application that is currently under development that we hope will dramatically simplify this process for folks. I think that we're probably looking at that being available sometime in the summer, although certainly please tune into our website for further details. We'll be blasting that everywhere once it's ready. I've got time for one last question, and it's about the role of SSRIs in eating disorders. And so the question is, because serotonin levels are abnormal, many patients have anxiety that predates the anorexia and are placed on SSRIs. Why do you think meds work if serotonin levels are high? So the vast majority of the serotonin in the brain is actually created from the body metabolizing proteins. And so what SSRIs do is it changes the way that the existing levels of serotonin in your brain are used. It makes more of that kind of hang out in the synapse, where it's more likely to relay serotonin-based signals, but doesn't actually change the gross levels. And if you look at well-controlled studies, SSRIs are actually not particularly beneficial for folks with anorexia. There's a little bit of data to suggest that in folks with bulimia, it might be helpful. But we really think that that's probably functioning more on the level of, if you're smoothing out somebody's mood dysregulation, they're going to have fewer symptoms, so far as reducing binge and purge episodes. And so one of the things that we see is that for particularly folks with anorexia, SSRIs are not of any particular benefit. And in fact, to touch the level of anxiety that we see, often you see very low doses of atypical antipsychotics prescribed, which also sometimes carry the beneficial side effect of increased weight gain, which can only help during a refeeding process. So one last question: how do you help the anorexia patient overcome the hot emotions, so anxiety, fear, that are associated during eating in the New Fed TR program? And are these brought up throughout the day? So yeah, it's the cool thing about the 5-day program is our staff are devoted to it the entire treatment day. And so if in the midst of a session there's a question about something that's related nutritionally, the dietitian's right there. We don't have to wait 2 hours to ask the dietitian. We say, hey, Sonia, so-and-so has a question. Like, let's come and sit down and think this through. So we'll have the case manager and the program director and the nutritionist all sit down and address the problem in the moment. And so one of the things that we do while there's high anxieties, we know that low levels of appropriate movement can actually help. So we'll walk a little bit. We're not talking about running or hiking, but a little bit of walking. And we'll practice deep breathing in the moment. One element of the treatment program is that we teach clients and their supports, here's a range of tools that can be helpful in dealing with that distress. And we help them practice it in the moment. And as much as possible, we encourage the supports to be the one walking the client through it, not us walking the client through it. I mean, really the whole point of the 5-day treatment program is that if folks are going to really have long-term success and recovery, the people who are the most important to them and who are closest to them have to know the things that need to happen and able to help them. And so we ask them to practice that during the week they're with us, because ultimately the home treatment team, the supports, and the client are the people who are going to make or break somebody's success. The 5 days that they're with us are just kind of a crucible to help get everybody pointed in the right direction. So I'd like to thank everyone for your attention and spending a little bit of your Wednesday afternoon with us, and for the outstanding questions. If you have further questions or things that you'd like to hear about, please don't hesitate to be in touch with us through the website.
Awesome, Jason. Thank you so much. And thank you all for your wonderful questions. And again, for your time today. Hey to London, thank you so much for joining us. Please look for our follow-up email. That'll have a link to the recording of today's webinar if you wanted to review the material, anything that you missed, or you just want to go over it again. And if you can take a moment at the end today as we're getting off of the webinar, it will redirect you to survey. Would love for you to take that real quick, 10 questions, very fast, not much of your time, just to help us plan for future events. So on behalf of Jason and the center, thank you for joining us and taking time to view our presentation. I'm Lori Johnson. Have a great day.